Welcome to Botkin Plus. It's May 20th, 2025, and my name is Nancy Gross. I'm a staff folklorist here at the American Folklife Center, and I have the pleasure of talking today to Dr. Lisa Gabbert, who's come to give a Botkin lecture on the medical carnivalesque. I always trip over that word. The medical carnivalesque folklore among physicians, and you've just given a terrific Botkin lecture, but we wanted to follow it up with learning a little bit more about your research and how you got interested in the topic. And also, I know you do a lot of other folklore-related research and writing, and so I just want to talk to you a bit about that.
Thank you.
So welcome to the library.
Thank you.
And do you want to start by saying a little bit about where you're from and how you got interested in folklore in general?
Sure. How did I get interested in folklore? Well, I am from Boise, Idaho. That is where I grew up, and went to school here in DC at Georgetown for college, which did not offer classes in folklore, so I didn't know anything about it as an undergraduate. And I think I got interested in it for a couple of different reasons. One has to do with my family background, which is my mom is an immigrant and came to the country after World War II. And so I always heard sort of stories about like the war in Europe and kind of their experiences there.
Where was she from?
So she was in the former Czechoslovakia, is where they came from, and they were an ethnic German group that were in that area, and then got kind of booted out during the war, I think, by the Russian army and stuff. And so people immigrated to the New York area, and then when I came as a child from Idaho to New York, we would go to these family reunions and hear these stories. And so I think there was just sort of this oral tradition in my family and this kind of old, quote unquote, old world dimension to it. My grandfather came over to work for Steinway, actually. And so he was the chief pattern maker for Steinway, and literally made the patterns. They would hire all these like Eastern European woodworkers. So he was a cabinet maker. So I was interested in that. And then one of my jobs right after college was actually working as a wilderness firefighter out in Idaho. And I remember being out there, and one of the things that firefighters will do is they'll tell riddles, because there's lots of downtime, so you're just kind of hanging out and talking, and people will just tell riddles. And I remember very specifically thinking, wouldn't it be very interesting if you could study riddles? But too bad you can't do that. I don't know anything that you could. So eventually somebody mentioned that word folklore to me, and it seemed like that was a word that encompassed lots of different things I was interested in. So I was interested in languages. I'd gone to Georgetown because I thought I wanted to be a translator. I was in their School of Languages and Linguistics. But I was also, what I was really interested in was culture. I just didn't really know it. So that was the word that sort of kind of put everything together, and then I applied to a master's program at UCLA, which had a master's degree program at that time, and got in, and that kind of put me on the path. But I really went into a master's program not knowing very much about folklore.
And then you went on to do your PhD at
was it Indiana?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I went from the master's degree at UCLA to PhD in Indiana, and then I was in Indiana for a very long time, probably eight or 9 years, I'm sure. And then ended up doing a combined PhD with folklore and American studies. So at that time, if you had a home department, such as folklore, you could do an extra year or so's worth of classes and then take the qualifying exams in American Studies too, and then you got what was a combined PhD as long as your dissertation sort of addressed both.
And what did you write on for your PhD?
I wrote on the folklore of Idaho. I was very interested in kind of place and landscape, and there was an area in Idaho that I just couldn't find very much on the folklore and folk life there, so I was interested in exploring it. And I was very much interested in kind of questions of how does folklore reflect the environment, and what is the relationship of folklore to the environment. So I just looked at a lot of different genres, essentially. I looked at some vernacular architecture, and I looked at kind of local speech patterns and a festival that was there, and cobbled together a dissertation in that way.
And that came out as a book?
No. What I did was I published a few articles. So I took some of those chapters of the dissertation and spun off different articles. And then when it came time to write a book, because of course if you get a job as an academic, you're supposed to write books. What I took was one chapter of that dissertation, which was on a winter carnival, and expanded that into a book, because I felt like that festival, which was called a winter carnival, out of all the things that I had done that initial field work on during the dissertation, it would give me the best insight or the best window into the community. And so it was sort of a hunch, I guess, and that's what ended up being the book. The book was entirely about the festival, so I took that chapter and expanded it into a book and looked at the community. So that book was called Winter Carnival in a Western Town, and it's on this winter carnival in McCall, Idaho, which is a very small little old logging town in west central Idaho. And they had been transitioning from essentially undergoing deindustrialization. So they used to be in logging town. They had this emerging identity as sort of a destination resort, and I used the festival to kind of look at that, how the festival negotiated that.
Interesting. And you went, after you, or maybe even before you finished, you started teaching. Can you talk a little bit about your career as a teacher, because you've trained innumerable colleagues now?
Yeah. Well, you get old, and there's a lot of people that come through.
Let me rephrase that.
That's okay. No, I got a job basically right after I defended, right after I graduated at Utah State, and I've been there since then. And Utah State was just a really good fit for me because my research was in the West, and in Idaho, and their folklore program there was connected to American Studies. So Barry Tolkien at the time had to retire for health reasons, so they were looking for somebody who had kind of a Western orientation in their research. And they have a really great archive, and the really fun thing about teaching at Utah State is you have folklore colleagues, which is not always the case. So sometimes you'll meet an academic and they're like the only folklorist in their department or in their entire university. And I just feel really lucky to have been at Utah State, because there are like several folklorists working in different capacities, and they've always had a very strong public sector component to folklore in Utah. So there's just like a lot of folklorists floating around. Which is,
I believe you're head of the department, the program now in the English department for folklorists.
Yeah. So we are a program that's always been associated with the English department. So I'm chair essentially of the folklore program, or director, I guess is what we call it, of the folklore program. But yeah, the students have been great. We have a small minor, and then we have a master's program. So we usually take 3 or 4 students a year, and been working with graduate students so for a long time, and they're great. They're just, you always learn from them. You're always like, I never thought of that. You should write about that.
You worked with the American Folklife Center over the years on some of our field schools.
Yes.
I forget when the first year was. We've had a long history of working with training folklorists in the field and students in the field to do folklore, and that was we paired with you for what was it 2000?
Two of them. I think the first one was 2013. I want to say.
Okay.
And the second one was probably 2015.
15.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I had always wanted to do a field school. One of the first field schools happened when I was a graduate student at IU with the Bloomington on the Square field school. And I was really interested in them. And then Randy Williams, who was our old Fife archivist, had always wanted to do a field school. And at some point we realized, we should do a field school together. So Randy and I partnered together, and then we put these two schools together. The first one she sort of took the lead on, which was the one about refugee voices. And then the second one in 2015, which was bigger, which was a residential field school where the students came and lived at the field school for a couple of weeks. And we partnered with Teton National Park and their Cultural Resources program there to document the Triangle X Dude Ranch that Andrea Graham, who's also a public sector folklorist, she was also in on it. So it was really Utah State University, Cultural Resources at Grand Teton National Park and the University of Wyoming and the Library of Congress. So it was a lot of institutions and moving
And some of our
parts.
staff went out. It was, what, 2
They did.
weeks?
Yeah, it was 2 weeks. We lived in, well, originally we were supposed to live in a biological research field station in the park. It was great. They had these old cabins, like they're probably CCC cabins, and the University of Wyoming had owned them. And it was right on, I think it was on Jackson Lake. But unfortunately, which has gone down in the folklore of field schools, it turns out that the main lodge had an historic bat colony that lived in, because it was this old CCC thing, you've seen these like huge stone chimneys that heat everything, so there's a bat colony that lived in there. And while we were staying there, they started to hatch. I think they were having babies because it was, early in the summer. And so we had to evacuate. Well, actually, it was later. So it was about August. But we had to evacuate because bats are a health risk, for rabies. And we all had to troop down to this little tiny county hospital and get rabies shots because we had been exposed. And then we had to, unfortunately, leave this amazing biological field research station on the edge of the lake and go stay in town, which was like during the height of the tourist season. So it was a lot of chaos.
This has become legendary. And we heard back here in Washington, we heard back from our staff members who are out there involved
Trying to
in
figure
all
out
this.
what was going on.
And how many people were involved?
I think we must have had about 20 to 23 people go and get the series of rabies shots. And it was one of those things I was telling you earlier where you got some information and you're like, okay, we can deal with this, and get more information comes in. And of course the students are all tweeting and on social media. They're like, oh my gosh, there's bats. And their parents are like, what's going on? And I think we ended up on the CDC's radar, like they had to report it as a mass outbreak of rabies because I think the hospital had to import more doses because no hospital will carry that many doses of rabies. And it's like a 2 or 3 week regimen. It's not like you go in and get one shot. It's a series of shots for multiple weeks. So it's definitely gone in folklore.
Dedicated,
Yeah.
Dedicated fieldwork. Fieldwork can be rough, even under the best of circumstances.
Well, that's what we say. We told the students, we're like, this is actually like what happens if you are, somewhere you have to be flexible and figure things out. We did actually manage to, complete the project, and the students did the interviews and stuff, but there was about a week where it was just complete chaos. And, we're trying to figure out where we're gonna sleep and what's safe and what do we do and are the bats a threat and things like that. So yeah. Yeah, in fact, one of our students who went on for a PhD after that, she designed a T-shirt. She was a good artist, and the T-shirt has it's of a bat. It said 2015 Field School. It has a bat on it with wings, and he's got headphones on and a little recorder. It's very cute.
Oh, we might need to check whether we have that in our collection. I'm not sure we do, but we'll need a picture of it. We'll need a picture of it at the very least. Can we talk a little bit about your latest book, The Medical Carnivalesque, which you just gave this great lecture on, and I'm interested in how you got interested in medical folklore, because that's been a long-standing interest of yours.
Yeah, it has. It happened because my husband decided to go to medical school while I was doing my graduate work, and he had already been thinking about it anyway because he's got medical people in his family. But he had been around folklore and folklorists enough that he understood what it was, and would just, occasionally bring home examples. But they were funny, and they were kind of, weird and a little transgressive, and I didn't really know what to do with them, so I just kind of kept these examples in like various folders and things like that, and thought, well, maybe at some point I'll, but I was like, I got a PhD to write, I can't do anything with this right now. But then over time, as he went through the rest of his training, and other folklorists in the field were also thinking about the relationship of folklore to medicine, I felt there was a lot focused on, different aspects of folk medicine or traditional medicine or alternative medicine. There was a lot focused on sort of patient-centered approaches to medicine. There was a little bit on physician folklore, but I just felt there was more that could be done there. And the more I kind of delved into that material, the more interesting it became. And then because I'd already written a book on festival, which of course if you write anything on festival or study about festival, you know of this concept of the carnivalesque, because that comes from festival theory. So then it made sense to me to use this framework, and then the more I applied that framework to the material and got into the history of that idea, the more it made sense. So I don't know if I hadn't written that book on this Winter Carnival and been interested in festival theory a little bit, if I would have come upon that framework or not. It just kind of seemed kind of organically happened. But yeah, so then when I decided to get serious about it and really do field work, I applied for an Archie Green Fellowship, and you guys very graciously granted me the fellowship, and that gave me the space to be able to do interviews with the physicians, and those really gave me a deeper perspective into the training. I had sort of kind of anecdotal training or experience with it as my spouse went through it. But then really to have those physicians talk about, and what really popped out for me in those interviews was how difficult the work was. It was really very difficult work. And I think even watching my husband go through it, it wasn't quite the same as doing some of those interviews and really having conversations with people about what it really means to be a physician. And that's when that work really started to kind of come together for me, these different aspects of it.
What did your husband think about you studying doctors?
Oh, he thought it was a good idea. He's always thought the culture of medicine is a little, not the healthiest. And so I've had lots of conversations about physician health and sort of the organization of the work and kind of the craziness of it. So I think he's always been very supportive. He really thought it was important work, and for physicians, that's really his perspective, is that he, I think both of us it would be nice if this could be used in some way to help medical culture change a little bit. And make it healthier for everybody involved. Because he's always thought that folklorists do a better job of studying culture in some ways than other ways. Physician culture, I think they get training in their own culture, and he's never found it very satisfying. So if that makes sense.
Interesting. Did you find physicians willing to speak to you, or anxious to speak to you? Were they fairly open about when you started interviewing them?
They were. I think it definitely helped that I was a little bit of an insider, because since I had that access, and one of the most difficult things about that fieldwork was I really needed physicians' cell phone numbers, and having they don't give out their cell phone numbers to everybody. But surgeons in particular, they can't tell me their schedules, so it's very difficult to set up an interview. So, because they don't know their schedules, they don't know what's going to happen. So they would say something like, well, I think I have maybe a couple of hours tomorrow. How about, I text you? And so I really had to be ready to kind of jump in order to be there if they were available. Or they could have said, no, we have this emergency, I can't do it, let's use some other day. So you really need like a lot of flexibility and pretty immediate means of communication.
This was, if I remember correctly, this was in 2019, so it was right before the pandemic, but you were also involved in a special issue of humor in the pandemic was that a Journal of Folklore Research?
Yes, correct. Yeah, they were putting together a special issue of it, and since I had already been studying it, I really, in that article, looked at a lot of the online humor. And it touches on some of what I talked on today, which is that particularly during the pandemic, where an understanding of what this new virus was and how it operated, and people didn't fully understand if it was airborne or like how you could get it. So the information was changing a lot, and there was also a lot of sort of sometimes bad medical information that came out, and how do you sort out what's good medical information and bad medical information, and debates about masks and all of that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of humor in which I think what I argued in the article was that pushed back against some of these questioning of medical authority and stuff that's continuing today essentially. But yeah, the pandemic changed because that actually happened kind of in the middle of the interviews. So I had a period of time where I was doing interviews, and then all of a sudden the pandemic happened, and then hospitals started shutting down, and I was still interviewing them, but sometimes we were outside, and sometimes we were in masks, and sometimes not. And so some of the photographs in that collection, you can see like in the background that the hospitals will have the heroes work here signs and things like that. So it was a little challenging, but as we talked about, you have to be flexible in field work and just figure out how to.
And you had experience with bats
yeah,
already,
how to make it happen,
yeah.
and that kind of thing. Yeah, so it was good, and I think most people. The other thing that's interesting about talking to physicians is that they're people who have a lot of power, but they're also fairly highly regulated. So they are regulated by state agencies and by federal agencies and by licensing agencies, HIPAA regulations, hospital regulations about what they can talk about and what they can't and things like that. And I think for them to talk about themselves was very weird. Like it was a kind of a new experience. Like a lot of them seem to appreciate the opportunity to be able to reflect on, oh, here I am, a 50-year-old physician. What did this choice of an occupation do to me? Or what has been the impact that it's had on my life? Because, most people make a decision to do something when they're in their early 20s, and then they just do it, and you just follow along that path,
Well, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It looks great. I think it's doing very well. Now, what's your next project? What are you working on now?
My next project is to figure out what my next project is.
I see.
What I would like to do is to sort of bring information, about medical culture and the way that I've formulated it to the book to physicians and the medical world. And so I haven't done it, but one of the things I've thought about doing is maybe instead of focusing my publications in folklore journals and making it academic, is to maybe focus in medical journals. So they have in medical journals sort of opinion pieces and perspective essays and things like that. We're non-medical, so they'll all have their medical research articles, but they'll also have places where other kinds of research are open for it. And I have a physician that I collaborate with occasionally, so we've sort of talked about maybe we should co-author articles. He's doing a series of lectures on this concept. We actually gave co-gave a talk not that long ago as part of Grand Rounds at the Medical College of Wisconsin. So we're not 100% sure where it's going to end up, but I would like to definitely continue that trajectory of making sort of physician health and the health of medical culture a priority.
Okay. Well, good luck. It sounds, all this sounds fascinating, and you do such great research. I'll look forward to your next, whatever you do next. And
Thank
we'll have
you.
to have you back again. But thank you for coming to the library. Thank you for doing such an excellent Botkin lecture.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really
and we will
appreciate it.
keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you very much.